2020, the longest 2 weeks of my life. I don't really recall when I first heard about the plague. It was called Corona then, and I'm not sure when exactly the name was changed to COVID-19, but it was during the first lockdown. I'd been ill in the first week of February, just a month or so before the first lockdown in the UK. I just thought that I had the flu, but after reading about the plague symptoms, I prefer the plague to its real name. It's like I just can't bring myself to say, all right, the real name continuously. It would feel like I was performing some kind of spell and evoking it. Anyway, when I read about those symptoms, they were very familiar to what I had suffered that first week of February, except the breathing issue symptoms. I had not had those. As I said, I just thought I'd had the flu. Was stuck in bed for the week, could not eat, but I recovered. I just assumed, gave a self-prognosis at the time. The reason I was so ill was because I'd not actually had flu for many years, so it just hit me hard. I'd never heard of the plague that was about to shut the whole world down. I don't have a TV and rarely listen to the radio. I read just headlines in social media unless it's a topic that I'm particularly interested in. The first time I'd heard of the plague, well, like I say, I don't really recall. The first time I took note was when my boss turned up at my work. I work in a kiosk in a park. My boss gave me a free bottle of sanitizer and then told me to shut the kiosk down. Then I was informed that I would not be needed to work for the foreseeable future. Wished me luck, saying, "See you on the other side," before disappearing out the door. The other side of what? I was all a bit stunned and forgot to ask, would I still be paid for the next week? The shifts that I'd been given had just been cancelled on me. Luckily I was, but that was only after I rang and complained about this sudden retraction of work and what I was to do for the next 2 weeks with no pay. 2 weeks, that's what I was told, that's what was being predicted. 2 weeks to flatten the curve. I didn't really understand what that meant, but went along. 2 weeks and we'd be back to normal. Well, that was nearly a year ago. Well, it was over a year ago, actually. It was a year to the day, just a few days ago, before I started recording this. I write this in 2021. I started writing this at the start of the Chinese New Year of the Ox. As I say now, it's March I think it's the 12th. So it was a year yesterday that we've been sent into all this pandemic and lockdown, saying by the government that it would only be for 2 weeks, the longest 2 weeks of my life. 2, the number 2, 2020, 2 twos, 2 weeks, 2. But let me get back to when it started. I lived in a bedsit at the time. I was what was termed a 0-hour employee. Furlough was not being offered, and the landlord was not too happy, and the same thing was happening with the other tenants. In the first month of lockdown 1, the landlord called a meeting. He came to the house. To all of us, he gave back our deposits and told us to leave as soon as possible. He gave us 3 weeks to get out and said we could live rent-free until then, but we had to go. He would not listen to our protests, just apologised and left. At the time, it seemed very strange behaviour, and one of the other tenants said something that caught my attention. Why does he want us out? What does he know? Another tenant replied, it's because this is the end of the 3rd week of lockdown and none of us have work, so no rent from us if this continues. But it'll be over soon, said the 3rd tenant. All back to normal. Those famous words, back to normal. Words that were to haunt me for the next year. Everyone kept saying we'll soon be back to normal. Well, things are never going to be normal again, are they? All 4 of us tenants sensed that the words were not quite right. That day I remember worrying, looking for new accommodation, but at that moment the 4 of us all sensed or realised things were never going back to normal. To cut a long story short, I could not find new accommodation. Nobody was taking on new tenants, which was worrying. I went to a few rental agencies, but they were either closed for lockdown or were put off finding me a place to live because I did not have a job that was offering furlough. At the age of 50 years, with 3 decades of independence, I had to return to my parents, who were not too happy at the prospect either, but who kindly let me move in. All my life's belongings and accumulations just about fitted into the spare room. Some spilled over and had to be put into the shed. I dumped long time unworn clothes in the clothes refuge bins and abandoned much love, but not long read books at the local People's Library donation box. I love my books. I thought I'd be there for just a few weeks until everything got back to normal. My parents are elderly and live in a small estate, a bus ride to the next town. It's the same house that I grew up in, so I knew the area, the council estate surrounded by woods in the north and fields and heathland in the south. East leads to Kent, west to London. Ah, London. I didn't realise how much I would miss the bright lights of London. Meeting and eating with friends. I missed attending societies and going to musical bashes. I've always been a social person, so at first this was I was a bit miffed by what was going on, and that I had to stay in. I had to get my head around that fact. My rebellious nature wanted to go out and see people, visit places, but who and where? Nobody was coming out. It's only 2 weeks, so I was told, and I kept telling myself to read some good books, which I did, go for long walks with the dog, which I also did. The woods were welcoming, other dog walkers were too. Joggers would run past us with a smile and a wave. Then the cold weather came in late March, but I'd still go for walks as did other locals. So the 2 weeks were turning into a month, and then 2 months. And then there was the announcement this lockdown would continue for another few weeks. With that came warmer weather, and with the warmer weather, more people ventured out to the woods. It was good to see families enjoying themselves. The usually quiet woods was filled with kids shouting joyously. Kids' laughter rang through the trees. The woods became energised with the new family spirit, though one had to dodge cyclists and the odd teenage gang. The roads to the woods got busier with cars, and unfamiliar faces were spotted entering and exiting the woodland gates. People were coming from afar. I didn't mind this. My hope was people were reconnecting with nature. As the summer came and the nights grew shorter, I thought that I would spend the night in the woods. With my portable telescope, I planned to watch the stars. It was a clear, warm night, and with my eyes adjusted to the summer darkness, I headed in. But my plans were thwarted. I had not gone very far into the woods when I could hear teenage voices, a lot of them coming and going from different directions. I was not alone with nature. And this kind of put me off. I didn't want to encounter them. And I could hear some of them having a rather great time on their bikes. I'd seen the lights from their phones in the distance, so I and the animals of the woods retreated to the safety of our homes. I was not concerned that they might be plague carriers. I was concerned with confrontation. What would they do if they came across me? What if they were violent and smashed up my telescope in a drunken stupor? What if they were high on drugs and mistook me for some woodland monster? My nerves had got the better of me, and my nighttime plans for connecting with nature and the stars were overcome with anxiety and a need to go home. And it wasn't just that night. There were reports that this happened most nights. Teenagers, young adults in the woods all night. Locals were kind enough to pick up the litter they left, snack wrappers, alcohol containers, helium canisters and much more. When I was a teenager, I'd hang out in the woods with my friends, but in those days we'd take our litter to the bins. We were well trained, having been brought up with the Wombles on TV, telling us littering was bad. Why do people litter? Why do people think it's okay to just casually drop the litter as they walk? What goes through these people's minds when they do this? I don't need this anymore, so I will just leave it here, and so the trash builds up. Which brings me to masks. In the UK, the mask rule was brought in a few months into lockdown. Disposable masks were available for free at transport hubs or could be bought at various shops. It was not long before discarded, used and worn masks were appearing in the streets, usually at curbside, where a driver would get out of car and just drop it. Knowingly or not, I'm not sure. Okay, some folk will have accidentally dropped their masks. Many folk carry them in their hands to the shops, don it going into the shop, remove it when they're coming out of the shop, and so could accidentally drop it. But with this fear of catching the plague, why do so many people just discard their used masks in the street? The government was not providing the toxic bins for these masks that would have germs from this highly contagious plague for people to drop their used masks into, and I'm beginning to see used masks everywhere. I see them in the streets, bushes, in the woods. Who's wearing a mask in the fresh air of the woods? Common sense seems to be in low supply, or as my friend once said to me, common sense is not very common. I mentioned fear, so I'm going to backtrack a little. I remember in those first 2 weeks of lockdown that fear was in the air. Everybody was concerned. There'd never been anything like this before in living history. People were scared of catching the plague. The news on all medias were telling us how deadly the plague was and how fast it was moving across the world. Country after country was going into lockdown. The world was shut. I'd go out at night to walk the dog at about 10 p.m. and my solar plexus would be reeling. Should I be out walking the dog? Am I allowed to do this? Few people were about. In fact, the first few nights it was just me and the dog, and I had to wonder if I was allowed to do this. Maybe there's a curfew that I'd not heard about. The air was heavy, full of darkness, and not just darkness from the night. Darkness which I now realise was the fear from everybody. The energy was dark as people stayed locked indoors to keep the germs out. People, including myself, were in shock. Shock at what was happening. It was akin to being in a bad B movie. What if this plague did turn people into zombies or vampires who only came out at night? Maybe that's why no one was allowed out at night. Then the dog and I were vulnerable. Should I start carrying a holy water and a cross with me? This feeling went on for the first week. I remember by the beginning of the second week I was not going to walk through this stilted air anymore, and I began to mutter under my breath mantras, Om Mani Padme Hum, to dispel the dark evil and exorcism prayers that I know. In the second week, on the second night, I saw another dog walker, and we had the socially distanced chat about what was going on, whilst our dogs socially played together. The dog walker too had been unsure as to whether he could walk the dog at night. Like mine, it was used to a late night walk. Dogs don't understand lockdown, nor do they watch the news. They just want their routine walk. Over the next week, other dog walkers, having seen that we were doing our late evening walk, soon resumed their routine of late evening walks, and many of us were nodding as we passed each other. The evening air became lighter, though not completely free of that dense fear and shock that lingered in the atmosphere. I can't remember if it was the second or the third week of lockdown that I saw the UFO. It was about 10:30 at night, a Tuesday night. It hung in the air, and I was guessing over the next town a couple of miles away. It was huge. It had lights, but I could not define its shape. I watched it for a good 5 or 6 minutes, and it just did not move. Now, I know the difference between planes, helicopters and UFOs. This was not a plane. A plane does not hover. It was not a helicopter. It was far too big, and also it made no noise. After about 6 minutes, the dog was fed up with standing around, so I continued walking the street. It was about, 2 or 3 minutes later that I could see the UFO slowly lift upwards, lights still sparkling. Again, not something a plane can do. A plane does not ascend in a straight line. Then, quick as a flash, it shot off in the direction of the other town, from the other town actually, very fast, and it went away far into the distance. Where I was living, everybody was being social and friendly, following guidelines, socially distancing, smiling and waving, chats across the road, chatting in the socially distanced queues for the little shops. Thank the gods the little shops were open, the corner convenience store, the butcher's, the milkman in his float. It meant I only had to go to a town for a big shop once a week. For a while the buses were free to travel on. just to keep everybody safe, I suppose. I appreciate the bus drivers still worked, and it was good of them to make their ride free. But not many folk used the buses. Essential travel only meant few people were going out. After a few weeks, people began to don masks. Not many weeks later, the UK government made it compulsory. One could be exempt if one fitted into one of the categories laid out on the government guideline website. I fell into that category. I tried wearing a mask at first, but it set off the neuralgia in my face. Neuralgia is awful. Many people get it in their limbs. My face is where I get it. The nerve from the top of my head down to my jaw vibrating so hard and harshly that the face ache it causes makes one suicidal. A doctor once told me that I was lucky that I did not get it in both sides of my face at the same time. Thankfully, it alternated. Nothing is able to stop it. Tiger balm numbs it, and ibuprofen just dulls it, but it's still there in the background. I rang my doctor and told her that it was starting again when I wore a mask, and she told me to make myself exempt. It's an odd feeling seeing all these people in their masks. It did not take long before folk designed their own or bought designer versions, and it was funny seeing people wear them out and about in the high street, then bump into an acquaintance and they'd pull it down so that they could talk. People wore them in different ways, and soon signs started to appear telling people to wear them properly over mouth and nose, and it was quite funny seeing them hanging from people's ears or just over their chins. My exemption certificate was in a lanyard. A sunflower pattern was easily recognisable and people respected it. But when autumn came and the weather changed throughout the day, I must have lost it while zipping my jacket up and down, depending on the temperature. I returned home one day, took off the lanyard and saw the plastic pocket with the exemption card was missing. I could not buy another one because nobody sold them anymore, so I had to print off another card from the government website. It was in paper, and since no shops were open to buy a plastic wallet, I would walk around with it in my hand, holding it out, Dalek-like, as people would glare at me for being maskless. Nobody ever gave me grief for not wearing one, except one time. I got on the bus, showed the driver the card, and walked down the aisle to get a seat. Only one other person was on the bus, a very sweet, dear old lady. Yet she looked at me, horrified. She stared at me, horrified. As I walked by, she shrieked at the driver, "She's not wearing a mask!" So I walked by, showed her my card and explained, but I could see the fear in her eyes, and she just kept repeating to the driver that I was not wearing a mask. I sat at the back as the driver told her it was all right, but she was not happy about it. I did feel sorry for the woman. Obviously she was scared. She was in the vulnerable age sector, as the government on the news kept telling her. She probably watched all the news reports that were constantly going out, its statistics of death, infections and medical advice. The news programmes programming most people to live in fear. Programmes and programming. It's all linked, but one cannot explain that to people like herself. The news reports were full of jargon and statistical reports, and I'm sure 87% of statistics are made up on the spot. How to stop fear in these people? How to stop the fear that these people were feeling? Where were the reports telling them that thousands of people survived this plague? People were getting ill, but they recovered. But there were too many horror stories of people dying in the plague, and it was this kind of news that the newspapers and the TV shows reported. Horror stories make headlines. Statistics confuse people. Numbers of deaths were going up, and that's what people were being told, not the numbers of people who caught it, who were ill for a week or so and then got better. The 2-week lockdown that was proposed went on for 4 months. Spring came and warm weather. With the roads so quiet, the birdsong was noticeable, which was a delight. I remember going for a solo walk in a field and 2 butterflies flew around me. With the absence of traffic, I could hear their wings flutter. Then they were gone to fly over the budding flowers and the growing grasses. Some mornings I watched the glorious sunrise, and I always tried to make sure I saw it set, but as the days got longer, I seemed to sleep in later and began to miss the dawn and its chorus. I spoke to work colleagues. We were still not being furloughed due to the grey area around casual 0-hour workers. We sent a collective email to the boss complaining about this, and a dialogue began. In the end, we were furloughed on minimum pay for 2 months, which was ridiculous. When May came, they offered us work, 1 day at the weekend. We were to work in pairs, patrolling the parks. I smelt a rat. When I arrived, we were given blue high-vis waistcoats on the back of which was written, "Please keep your distance," with the 2 man symbols and a couple of arrows. I wasn't happy with that. I didn't want to be a billboard for fear-mongering. We were given sanitizers, gloves, masks, and told to go out and disperse crowds. I was about to argue against this, but my colleague gave me a look, and the boss left us to it. Neither of us, neither me nor my colleague, wanted to disperse crowds. Instead, we walked the park, which was packed with families, dog walkers, joggers, and people exercising. In fact, in all the years I've worked in the park, I've never seen it so busy or so full of litter. There was tons of it. We rang the boss asking for litter pickers, saying we'd do that, but we were told, "Nope, we have volunteers doing that." Instead of giving us that job, they put out requests to the good citizens of the local community to do that, and they'd been inundated with volunteers. Nice community spirit, but part of me felt they could have paid us to do that. We thought that this patrolling of the parks would be continuous work, but alas, it was just 1 weekend. I found out later by giving us 1 shift a week they no longer had to furlough us, and if we refused the shift we would not be furloughed because we'd turned down the work. A catch-22. So we weren't being furloughed because we were working, and if we didn't work we couldn't be furloughed because we turned down work. The boss wouldn't open the kiosk for us to work in because he thought it was not safe for us and would encourage people to come to the park. Well, people were already in the park, as I've already said. I've never seen it so busy. So why not take advantage of this and make some money by opening the kiosk? The powers that be would not do it, reinstating that they were keeping us safe. In early summer, the government set up testing centres where people could be tested to see if they had the plague. Apparently people could have it but show no symptoms. These people were called carriers, so people were encouraged to go for a test. I received a text from the government suggesting that I too went for a test. It did not say I had to, it was just letting me know that testing centres were available. I immediately reported it as spam. Why do I want to go for a test if there is nothing wrong with me? I show no symptoms. I am well, I am healthy. Irresponsible, you might say, but I felt strongly that these tests were unreliable, as it was explained to me how it was done. And I would recommend anybody interested in how these tests were done to have a look online and see what the statistics are and what the numbers are that they're using to be able to test people. It's not very good. Even the creator of the testing said that these were not accurate. I was sure that all this testing just added to their defensive stance that the government was promulgating constantly to stay at home. Then the boss I worked for got in touch, offering us a shift once a week, working at the testing centre. After going on at us that he was keeping us safe by not giving us work, he was now sending us to the front line. We weren't giving the tests. That was the army and then later G4 doing that. No, we were just at the entrance of a driving car park controlling the traffic. Oh, what joy! Seeing hundreds of people a day coming to be tested because the government was telling them to do so. During the gap between lockdown 1 and 2 in the UK, the testing centre got very busy as people had to be tested and get a negative result so that they could travel abroad for holidays. The Ipsos Mori kept sending me letters inviting me to register for a swab kit. Free they sent me, then a text, apparently to help measure virus prevalence in the area. Again came the conscience niggles of, I nearly said giggles then, again came the conscience niggles of, am I right to ignore this? Am I being irresponsible? I wonder if these were the questions people thought when they received their letters and texts, and so felt obliged to go for a test. Working at the site, I found it upsetting to hear kids screaming as mothers and fathers forced the scrubs up their noses and down their throats. Families argued as parents blamed each other for their kids' refusal to do it. Some families came back every week, traumatised kids in the back seats dreading the inevitable. I wonder if these kids will grow up with issues about this, perhaps hide away illnesses from their parents because of what they were put through in 2020, not wanting to go through it again. Will they have a mistrust of the medical profession because of this dramatic swab testing they were being put through when so young? Babies cried, toddlers screamed and fought, adults gagged as they tested themselves. Some were physically sick, all to be tested and hopefully told that they don't have the plague. I stand back from the bombardment of news and statistics. I want to announce that it should be morality before politics, and that there should be a call to conscience. But I will be shut down by those who say the government knows what it's doing and it's saving our lives. I know that I'm not alone in seeing that this is not true. Mental health issues are on the rise because of all this. The government and mass media is keeping very quiet about the rise in suicides, the rise in domestic violence and the breakdown of society. I can only pray for these people, all of them, that common sense will prevail, that people will stay sane, and more importantly, stop watching the news and the fear that it's sending out. It does seem a strange time, and as the Chinese proverb says, though some say it's a curse, may you live in interesting times. When all this began, I thought like everyone, just 2 weeks, but as that 2 weeks became months, I began to wonder if this indeed was the end times. As a kid, I used to believe that I would see the biblical end times, but I was told by many folk, every generation thinks this and thinks it's living in the end times. Times change, nothing stays the same, but us humans like the same. We like life routine. We like to feel safe and secure in it. Life is not like that. Things happen, changes occur, and it's how we handle it that brings the result. I grew up to always expect the unexpected, so I made sure I did not settle into any expectant routine in my lifestyle. And so I'm more prepared for unusual circumstances occurring and ready for the unexpected when it unexpectedly happens. Most people are not prepared for this. Most people live this life expecting it to be the same the next day, the next day, and the next day, and so on. I don't mind routine for a while, but if it goes on too long, I want to rebel and go and do something different. During lockdown 1, I tried to make my day varied. The dog was walked routinely, morning, afternoon and evening, but in between I tried not to fit into any kind of discernible pattern. There was not a lot of choice in things to do. Go for another walk, read a book, write a book, ring a friend, write a friend, watch YouTube, make a YouTube, do some art. Watch some BitChute, make a BitChute video, do some art. I realised that some of my friends were terribly bored, not knowing what to do with themselves. I'm lucky that I can keep myself busy and keep my own company, though this was tested during lockdown 1 and 2. I craved seeing other people, going somewhere else, and to eat in a curry house. I really miss going for a good curry with good company. Everybody was Zooming or Skyping each other, but I soon got Zoom Skype fatigue. It's just not the same as being physically with somebody for a chat. It's a very poor substitute, but I thank the internet and the tech gods and the inventor of the internet that we had it, just so that we could commune. "You're on mute" was the phrase of 2020. Social media was the saviour for so many. If we hadn't had the internet, what would we have done? Possibly upped and revolted to all this. There were protests worldwide, and I noted down the date and time for the London protest against the government lockdowns and masks. I intended to go because it would get me out of the house, plus I wanted to revolt. But I saw a report about it on social media. I'd missed it. Each day was coming so like the next that I missed the one day I could actually go out and go somewhere else and express my opinions about all this. Personally, I'd like to rebel against all of this, but how? It was becoming all a masquerade. Nothing is open to oppose them. One cannot go to a pub in defiance or a cafe to rebel. And one must remember that in ancient times and olden days, it was in the pubs that the rebels would start, the rebellion would begin, the rebellions would gather and chat in the pubs. London is in lockdown, so one cannot go and protest outside the PM's house because it's impossible to get there. And why rebel or protest there? My way of rebelling is to do the opposite to what I'm told. All I can do is go out of my house and walk the streets, but there's nowhere to go to. My only option is to post protest videos on social media, but since Big Tech is in charge, they can monitor that. They allow my videos, but I don't get to see, well, I don't seem to come up in the algorithms. Other people are not seeing what I've done unless they subscribe. I've had subscribers tell me that they are not being notified of my videos, or something has turned the notification bell off. One told me that he discovered he'd been unsubscribed. It wasn't him, nor was it me who did that. I don't think I can unsubscribe people from my channel. So the Big Tech has some kind of control over all of this. Thankfully, alternative platforms arose and I joined those, and my work seems to be getting seen, for now. Okay, I've broken a few rules, met the odd friend, and we've had a hug. Who can believe we can get arrested and fined for having a hug? I know how lucky I was with my health during lockdown, and I don't mean about not catching the plague, I mean other health issues. One friend had toothache during lockdown 1. Imagine that. Toothache and no dentist to go to. No dentist open, not even for emergencies. He lived on painkillers for months and apparently they only dulled the pain. Toothache is the worst, as many of us know, but what about other health issues? Okay, chemists and pharmacies were open for problems and cures to problems that could be brought over the counter. But as with friends with more serious illnesses told me, their appointments, operations, consultancies were all cancelled with no actual rescheduling date given. Another friend is on a board for a charity that deals with domestic abuse. The call centres were being inundated with calls. People were locked in houses with domestic violence occurring, and few people knew. Few people could get to them. How many have suffered from this problem because of a lockdown from a plague? Will it ever be revealed the true number of suicides? The mainstream media keeps quiet about all this, but not the social media. We know it's happening. Mental health issues from all this lockdown and the impact it has had on many, many people is going to be being dealt with for a long time to come. Why? Because nobody was prepared, because our governments did not take this into consideration. And what do? Well, they seem to be ignoring it. There is something seriously wrong with all this. I want to use the word dehumanisation. Does authority know best? Is authority too incompetent to see what they are doing? One does wonder sometimes what goes through the minds of those in charge. It must be quite a power buzz, or a weighty worry. One wouldn't want to be seen to get it wrong. One would want to be a hero for the times. All leaders must be ego-driven. Why else would they want to lead? It is the ego that drives one to do things, or not do things if one's ego is weak. I also suspect in these times that there are too many cooks in the kitchen, too many leaders, advisors, ego-driven personalities who want to take charge of the reins of the galloping horse that is this current situation. Individuals like myself feel that we are all being told what to think and what to do. And that's annoying for people like myself who want to be independent enough to do one's own investigations, to follow one's own intuition and make one's own choices. I thank the gods that I was not born into a fascist regime or dictatorship-led country where its citizens must follow the regime's orders. I don't think that I'm going to get shot for not believing the narrative, but I might get a damn good telling off. Who knows where all this is going to lead? What I do know is that I am not a sheep who needs to follow the herd. I'm pretty sure that my spider senses are right in saying that there's a fly in the ointment. Things do not look or seem right. Being a God believer, I can only turn to the divine to guide me, as I'm pretty sure that all the leaders, whether political, medical or fearmongers, have either got no souls or are puppets of the devil. So as I've decided this could indeed be the end times and prepare myself for Armageddon, I advise all to wake up, don't be controlled, and save your souls. It seems to be becoming a them and us situation, or as one neighbour put it, Gestapo or resistance. Many took all this far too seriously and refused to leave their abode. Some of those sorts did but maintain the correct social distancing and donned a mask. In 2021 I noticed some of them were double masked because one was not sufficient to keep the plague out. During one of our freedom spells between lockdown 1 and lockdown 2, a friend asked me to meet her at a museum. All good there. I was quite pleased to be seeing somebody and going somewhere else. At the museum she diligently kept her mask on, indoors and out. I noticed a little horrified look in her eyes as I strolled up to her, maskless, and went to greet her with a hug. Nope, she wasn't having that, and she queried my lack of face covering, so I showed her my exemption certificate. She asked what made me exempt, so I explained, and I could see she was not comfortable with this, as she ranted on about my safety is more important than if a mask gives me discomfort. All said at me from a few feet away and behind her mask, which muffled her voice so I could not hear her properly. So I had to keep asking her to repeat herself, and that repeatedly amused me as she reluctantly raised her voice from behind her mask and from a safe distance sprouted warnings about catching the plague. She then swiped her phone for the track and trace and nodded at me. I didn't have the app, but could see this was going to be a problem as she and security looked at me. So I took a risk and pretended to find the app on my phone and swiped it. Obviously nothing happened electronically, but that swipe pleased the others and I was let in. I was to discover later that this pretense worked at most places. People and staff just want to see that you are taking part. Very few actually check that you are genuine. Inside the museum, my friend wore her mask, and she also got frustrated if other museum goers stood too close to her. She had talked to me from the other side of an exhibition piece. I felt a bit deflated by it all, but said nothing. After our museum visit, my friend suggested lunch, and we walked down the street, she refusing to walk with me, but instead just walking ahead or either a few feet away from me, still donning her mask and making a big gesture at the cafe to swipe her track and trace app at the entrance. Inside we ordered our meals, and I noticed that she took her mask off when we sat down, waiting for our lunch, and then throughout our lunch, as we waited for our food, whilst we ate and whilst we had our hot beverage afterwards, she stayed maskless as she sat directly opposite me and talked. At one point she passed the salt and pepper without wearing her gloves or sanitising her hands, and she asked for the sauce after I'd used it, and I gave it to her without gloves on or sanitising my hands. She stood next to me, maskless, as we paid. When we were leaving the cafe, she donned her mask and went back to social distancing from me. She asked what I wanted to do next. I made my excuses and went home. I just could not face continuing this palaver. And so the madness continues. Many of us feel awkward at all this, unsure what to do. We can see the craziness of all this, yet feel we don't want to cause a scene to the frightened sheep who need to be told what to do by people who don't really know what to do. I don't want to upset people and understand their fear as they absorb the news programmes and the newspapers, and so they believe that if they step outside of their safe and secure house, that they will drop dead from a plague that's apparently roaming our streets, looking for victims. 2 weeks to flatten the curve has turned into 52 weeks, and from what I can see, lives have been ruined, not by catching this plague, but by being forced to lock down and become slaves to a system that does not really care about us. The casualties are not those who caught the plague, though I feel for them, and my condolences to the families of those who died of it. But many people die every day. die from all kinds of diseases, accidents and such like. People die, babies are born, but do souls develop? Or are our souls being tested at the lunacy of it all? As I've said, stay awake, don't be controlled, save your soul. I get it that people want to do the right thing. I too want to do the right thing. But I'm concerned when doing the right thing feels like it's a coercion into some kind of agenda. Things are changing in the world through all this, but is it for the better? Or is there some nefarious plan lurking in the background? I fear it is the latter. I sense it, I can smell it. My spider senses are telling me that something else is going on. People, and I mean the masses, are being led to some dark, dismal, coerced new way of life that is not humane. With all the religious buildings being closed, the few that did attend are not getting their spiritual bread. Those who did not attend and had no interest in that sort of thing had their other places of worship shut, pubs, cafes, social places of congregation. We're no longer allowed to meet except on Zoom or Skype or whatever video call takes your preference. It's not the same as meeting somebody in person, singing together with joy, whether it's hymns at church or a drunken ditty in a public house. We want to be free to meet. Those who are vulnerable to the plague can stay at home, and we won't come and visit them or interact with them until this whole thing is over and the plague and all other diseases are eradicated. Hold on, that's all a bit impossible. Surely we cannot eradicate a plague. It will mutate and still be a threat. So does that mean we'll never be allowed out again? A shiver goes down my spine. 2 weeks to flatten the curve. A year later we already have variants to the plague and we're still in lockdown. This all smells, feels, looks and sounds wrong to me. When I said this to somebody who is a follower of the mainstream narrative, she told me that I was a rebel and just wanted my freedom. She's right there, I do want my freedom. I don't want to be stuck indoors having my food delivered, glued to the TV and sometimes peeking out of my curtains like she is. I thank the gods that I'm not living a life in fear like that. Because fear is usually the reason, the reality, that one is not in control. One is being controlled, whether it is an emotional or psychological or intellectual reaction to it. So what is fear? Why is there so much fear? Fear of what's going on, fear of what's happening to our loved ones, fear that we're doing the wrong thing, fear that we are not doing what others are doing, fear that others are not doing what you're doing. We need to look at our fear, what we fear, why we fear, and why it affects me, you, and everybody else. Because clearly what it is we fear is usually the unknown. Then we work on making it known so we can face it. Whether it's an emotion, a situation, or facing a wild animal, we have to face that fear. What will happen to the likes of me? I feel like I've been drawn into some kind of psychological warfare, though not many are aware of this. There are those who follow the narrative of the mainstream and those who don't. How does one navigate one's way through all this? By looking within, finding one's conscience, sensing for truth, so all I can do is stay awake, not be controlled, and save my soul.